So I'm at a sister organization, right? I'm just half a mile down the road here. We are right now just shy of 300 people, all focused on the cortex, not just any part of the brain, but cortex in two so-called model system in mouse and in humans. Everything we do is focused around trying to understand what I think of the most complex piece of organized matter in the universe. And we studied for all the reasons that people usually do. A, for basic neuroscience, to try to understand how it processes information, something you're trying to replicate, to invert. And also because ultimately, in order to understand it, in order to help cure the many pathologies that our brain is prey to, we need to understand how it works at the basic science level. Now, however, what the brain also has, what makes it utterly unique so far at least, we'll have to see about computers, is that besides being responsible for all of our complex behavior, including language and planning and everything else you guys care about, it also feels like something to be the owner of a healthy brain. Right? So right now you actually see something, and you have a voice in your head, you have a light inside your skull. And it's not clear, or none of the evidence suggests that the other objects that science studies, like black holes and viruses and molecules and proteins and galaxies, that it feels like anything to be a black hole, a virus, or a galaxy. And then there are other periods, of course, when we don't feel anything, like when you every night you go to sleep and then everything turns off. Right? You may as well be dead because there isn't anything there. And then, of course, sometimes you wake up inside your sleeping body, and you do have experiences, and we call those dreams. And then, of course, there are other states of unconsciousness, like during anesthesia, and of course, the various states of pathological unconsciousness, like in a persistent vegetative state, in coma, etc. Plus, added to the mystery is the fact that we can do many, many, many things that we are not conscious of, or we're only conscious after the fact. Right? It's a discovery of the 19th century, Nietzsche and then Freud and everything since then, and it's now part of popular lore that much of what we do without being in the act. We're strangers to ourselves. Most of the things our body does, and including our brain does, we don't know how we do it because we don't have conscious access to it. So all of that throws light or helps us understand the question, where does this consciousness come from? And by consciousness, I simply mean experience. Very simple. I mean the fact that you have any experience at all, whether it's pain or pleasure or being you or remembering what you had for breakfast this morning, or being angry or feeling I freely willed my action. I freely willed that I was going to raise my hand, or having a feeling of intentionality. All those things that psychologists study since 200 years, those are all different. What's common to all of them is the fact that they involve experience. And the question is, how does experience come into the world? And what about our favorite objects? Computers, can they have, in principle, experience? In other words, is it possible to ever feel anything for a computer? Okay, so it's a popular book I wrote, and there's this is probably the most accessible article, just came out in a Philosophical Transaction. You can just grab off our archive. All right, so we have to start with one of the fathers of modern enlightenment, who also, of course, invented Cartesian coordinate system, etc., René Descartes, and probably in the most famous deduction of Western thought. He wrote Je pense, donc je suis, in his Discours sur la méthode in 1642 or so. 350 years ago. It's translated famously as cogito ergo sum. In modern language, we would say today, I'm conscious, therefore I am. What he meant, right? He tried to ignore what we today know as radical skepticism. Right? He says, what are the things I'm utterly certain of? And of course, he says, rightly, I'm not certain about my body or exact size or shape of my body because I could be mistaken. And of course, we all know we are very often mistaken about our bodies. Some of us may think, for example, we're incredibly attractive to the opposite sex, but in fact are not. But so we have these perceptions, and they often are erroneous. But he says the one thing that I'm utterly certain of, in fact, the only way I know I exist is because I'm conscious. So if you wake up, if you fly to China, or I'm going to fly to Rio, to Buenos Aires, and you wake up in the middle of the night in your hotel room, you're discombobulated because it's jet lag, it's totally dark, but you wake up and you don't see anything, you don't hear anything, you don't smell much, but you have some sense. You know you're awake, right? You have, at least you see the dark, you experience the dark. And so this is the only thing. This comes prior to even physics. So philosophers use the term, the only thing you have direct acquaintance with, the only thing you have direct acquaintance is your own consciousness. Everything else is secondary. Everything else is derived. Everything we know about the world, including physics and engineering, everything it makes a great deal of sense, but it's indirect. The only thing I directly acquainted with is my own consciousness. Right, so that's I think where we have to start. Now, we all think, at heart, most of us are so-called naive realists. That means we believe, well, it's actually very simple. There's a world outside there, and my brain helps me map it onto the inner screen, what I'm actually conscious of. And then, of course, there are endless illusions. This I just showed is one of my favorite ones, called the lilac chaser. If you just fixate at the central cause, you'll see how, in this case, naive realism is obviously utterly, totally wrong. Because what's actually present on the screen in terms of photons, etc., I don't know whether you can see it from that angle as well. But if you fixate, what you should be seeing is not anything what's actually there. And what you're seeing is entirely in your head, namely it's a green disk that moves. And this green disk seems to erase the underlying pink disks that are actually there. Right? So what is actually there, which is a bunch of disks with one missing, you don't see, but what's not there, namely a green disk, you do see. So much for so naive realism is obviously wrong. And I mean, this is not news.
Naive.
What? Well,
It's naive.
it's, yes. Yeah, I mean, clearly there is a mapping between the world. It is lawful, although it's, neuroscience and psychology for the last 150 years have been trying to find out the exact lawful relationships. And people still discover new illusions all the time, not visual, but also other illusions. But you can see it's very complicated, maybe it is very nonlinear, and there are all sorts of things. You're all familiar with this change blindness illusion, right, where people change and you don't even notice that they change. So, our brain isn't all that good, particularly if things happen very quickly at perceiving what's out there. So once again throws up the question, well, what is the relationship between the external world and the interior world of our experiences? Oops. Okay, so what is it we know about consciousness? Well, we do know it's associated with complex adaptive biological networks. Now, mind you, not all networks, not all biological networks. So, for example, we all have several immune systems, an acquired one and an innate one. You have no conscious experience of your immune system. So right now, some of you may fight off, your immune system might fight off a bug, but you don't know about it. Sometimes when you get fever, then of course you're aware that you have a temperature and you're aware of that, but you don't have direct access to your immune system. Although it has even memory, right? Because if you form antibodies, that's a form of memory. So it's interesting why it's also part of your body, so it is very complicated. So it's not apparent why that one works silent. It does its work without you having any access to it, why it should be. Now, even the brain itself, you may know we have a secondary brain in the gut. It's roughly a couple of 100 million neurons, enteric nervous system. It's perfectly decent brain. It has action potential, it has synapses, it has a neuron, everything you expect of a brain. Yet by and large, you have no conscious access to it. You do, of course, sometimes have a feeling of fullness when you eat too much or, nausea, etc. But we know that's generated by activity in cortex. So it's not clear why, again, this brain does what it does silent. We don't know, really. We know that consciousness doesn't require behavior. As I mentioned already one case, if you dream, while your brain is dreaming, your brain shuts down its behavior. In fact, you're paralyzed, everything except your eye muscle. That's why it's also called rapid eye movement. Because in some people where that paralysis is not complete, they act out their dreams. And, which includes violence. And of course, some people jump out of a window. And if you live on a high floor, that may not be so good. So your brain does shut down your muscles when you have conscious experience. We also know through pathological states like catatonia, where people are unable to move, yet they're fully conscious. So we know at least in the adult, you can have a conscious experience without having any behavior. We know primarily from our own experience, as well as from patients, from invalids, from people who come back from Afghanistan, for instance. A bomb may have taken away their legs and may have injured their brain. And you talk to these people and they have no affect. They have completely flat affect. You can just listen to them the way they talk. They have no emotions, partly because the injury has taken away the part of the brain that generate emotion, yet they're perfectly conscious. They can tell you what they feel and what they see, etc. So we know that emotions, of course, very important for normal, healthy life, but they don't seem to be essential for having experiences. We know through a lot of research, particularly my lab has done, but I'm not going to delve into further, paying attention to something, like you should pay attention to my voice or pay attention to your face, that may often result in being conscious of that voice or being conscious of that face. In other words, if you attend to something, typically you will become conscious of it, but now there are lots of experiments where people attend to something but don't see it. Seems very paradoxical, but experimentally it's true. You can attend to things that are totally invisible, that you don't perceive consciously, yet you can attend to them, and behaviorally you can show that people attend to them and they preferentially process that information, although they claim they don't see it. We know consciousness doesn't require language, and self-consciousness, that most people, if you ask them what's consciousness, most people will say, well, it's really self-consciousness. That is really a late stage both developmental and evolutionary adaptation. Typically only adults are self-conscious. Little kids have very little self-consciousness. Even boys, for instance, famously, if they're teenage, right, they will do sometimes really stupid stuff. You can probably all remember this. Where you do something really stupid and then your dad asks you, well, why did you just do that? And you say, well, I don't know, it just popped into my mind. We know this partly because your brain isn't fully developed till probably between 25 and 30. Now, there's still a myelinization there, the cabling around the axons don't fully develop till you're, really in your third decade, and those are typically the frontal parts of the brain are typically the one that give you access to internal states like self-consciousness. So we have it means literally adults have. Sometimes they have too much of it and it doesn't really lead to all that much happiness in your life if you introspect too much. Most animals don't have it. Some of you may know there's a famous test for self-consciousness. It involves a mirror, the so-called mirror test. And a lot of primates have it. Chimps, for example, have it. Other animals may have other very simple forms of consciousness, like dogs may have some form of olfactory self-consciousness, but in animals it's certainly much less highly developed than in us. But it's really just one aspect of consciousness. I'm a rock climber, for instance. If you're on the sharp end of a rope climbing, you're hyper-conscious of the environment. You're hyper-conscious of every little indentation in the rock. You're conscious of your way, how far you're above your last piece of protection. But that inner voice, that's always around, that criticizes you, all the stuff you haven't done and the homework and the tax return and your fight with your wife, all of those stuff, that's totally gone because you're all out there, right? Because the situation is dangerous, so your consciousness is fully engaged with the outside world. You have very little consciousness. So yes, self-consciousness is important, no doubt about it, but again, it's just one aspect of consciousness. We know...
Can you describe the mirror test? I'm not sure.
Yeah, so there's a standard test to test for consciousness, self-consciousness, really visual self-consciousness. You take babies and you, for example, at night when they sleep, or in animals, you anesthetize them, you paint something on their forehead, like just a black cross or something. And then, so in some babies, you do it before you give them a mirror. Some babies, you do it after them, you get a mirror. And then you see, before roughly 16 to 18 months, it changes depending on age, on gender and age, but roughly around there. If you do it before then, people, the babies see they see the cross, they look at them in the mirror, they don't do anything. But after that age, if you first show them the forehead and they know there's nothing, they see there's nothing there, and then they have suddenly they think they'll start doing this. Okay, so they have an image of themselves, and this image, does or does not include this mark, and so they know there's something different about them. So this is an operational way to test at least that you have a picture of yourself. Now, some animals also do that. There are great movies if you Google where chimps, particularly young chimp, it's really hilarious. So first when you expose them to mirrors, they think it's another ape. it's another ape, and they get very aggressive. Then they realize, you can really see, they get it. They get it, oh, it's themselves, and then they'll do this, and they'll do this. They try to inspect them, they do this. And then you can also do this test. So they realize that, again, they have a picture of themselves, and they know when there's a mark there that shouldn't be on there. Elephants do it, and dolphins, people have done a dolphin test, this mirror self-recognition. So it's a cute test.
Just have a quick question as well. Say consciousness does not require emotions. We said earlier on that consciousness, we talked all about feelings. So do you distinguish feelings and emotions?
Yeah. Okay. So I meant emotion in the sense that people mean it as particularly the strong emotions: anger, fear, disgust. What are the other ones? I mean those strong emotions. No, I mean ultimately it's all about experience. And some people, their language isn't very precise. Some people call the experience feeling. The fact that you see yellow here, the fact that you can describe it, as compared to your body making a visual motor response and pressing a button. That's the difference. In one case, you actually have an inner picture in front of your head. We know from split brain experiments done at Caltech, Reuters, Sperry, and all of that you can have half a brain, particularly you can have half a cerebral hemisphere, and you can still have conscious experience. And we also know, some of you have heard of a guy called Oliver Sacks, presumably, very famous, right? So he has all these books where he describes beautifully cases going back 200 years in the literature where people have very specific loss due to gunshot or a tumor or virus, where they lose a particular part of their brain, particularly the cortex, and that goes hand in hand with a very specific loss of conscious content. So they may, for example, like one famous painter he describes, they lose the part of the brain that's responsible for generating the sense of color. There's nothing wrong with the eyes, nothing wrong with the photoreceptor, but the painter doesn't see color anymore. It's just like, now you just see the world in shades of gray. Or you lose an area, it's more rare because you have to lose it on both sides, where you lose the sense of motion, and it's being a little bit like in a disco. So you see, there's change, but you don't sense motion. There's a feeling where you believe your wife or your spouse is a stranger. She's been exchanged for an alien. There you lose the feeling of familiarity. You can there's all sorts of strange things in the literature, but they have, we all know they have a discrete basis. There's a Cotard syndrome where you believe you're dead. You think, well, they're just wacky. Well, no, they're actually not wacky. Their body doesn't give them any feedback anymore, so they have no proprioceptive feedback anymore. And so they feel like they're dead. They don't feel themselves anymore. There's alien hand syndrome where people think this hand doesn't belong to me, and they complain in bed that somebody kicks them out of bed every night. In fact, it's their own body, and they fight with their own body because they've lost the conscious representation of that side of the body. So that tells us there's also something local about consciousness. There's something global, but there's also something local. In this case, specific chunks of cortex provide specific conscious content. All right, and then I mentioned this already, this is the realization really of the 20th century. There's untold things that you do without being conscious. Either you're not conscious at all, like for example, you're not conscious really of your blood pressure. You're not conscious of your pH in your stomach. Although there are lots of systems in your body that are sensitive to the pH and that are sensitive to the blood pressure, but it's something you don't have access to. Any overtrained routines. Keyboard typing is beautiful experiments. We can type vastly faster on our keyboards than we have conscious access to. And in fact, if you have to consciously realize each letter, then you greatly slow down and you make many, many more mistakes. But that's, of course, a highly overlearned activity. So characteristic for all of those things is you needed to be conscious early on when you learn to climb or dance or drive. But then once you do it automatically, it's essentially down-compiled and done by a different part of the brain, typically by the basal ganglia. And so you can think of these downloaded, these compiled routines, which you do again and again and again, like driving a car, and a different part of the brain takes over and executes. And you only need to be conscious at the high-level part. Every time you talk, right? Every time I give a talk, it's not that there's a conscious Christoph who sits inside, who plans in German the next sentence, and then I send this German sentence to my English routine, and then it translates into English. Half the time you don't really know what you're going to say till you hear what you actually said.
Can I ask you a quick question? You said something I just want to make sure I understood about the compilation, because I thought that
various activities were pretty localized. That's why, when we're seeing, in our mind's eye food, there's a lot of similarity in the brain to when we're actually experiencing food.
Yes, that's true.
What you said now sounded to me, that's why I want to make sure, like it was like, okay, this running on one CPU, and then we just transfer the same activity to a different core. So it's really like transferred to a completely different place, and there's no aspect of it in the original location.
No, what seems to be happening so simultaneously, people have done, for example, for playing shogi or for playing chess. So early on, you involve all your cortex because you really have to think very deliberate. And then if you do it a longer particular expert, cortex becomes less involved, and it's really a particular part of the basal ganglia that are involved. But again, and the more people are expert, the better they are at their very narrow domain of expertise, the more activity in those parts of the brain lights up. It makes sense for things that you do, when you spend half your day doing whatever, typing or playing chess, that it would be too expensive to constantly think about it consciously, rather than you think at a very high level. The low level is taken care of by parts of your brain that you simply don't access consciously. So, for example, when people have intuition, usually when they have intuition, certainly for experts, they just know this is the best move. And typically then they have to reflect, well, why do I actually know this? And it takes them some time. So typically what you see in those cases, or with computer codes, people have also done this when they analyze people who are like you, who are computer programmers, when you just know this is the best way to do it. What happens, you have an underlying part of your brain that you trained up, it generates an answer, it sends it up to Cortex, and then Cortex is just confronted, I know this is the answer, and then Cortex has to be active to say, well, wait, why is it actually the best answer? But that involves a different part of the brain. And of course, there's 100 years, I mentioned already, of Freud. Some of you, once you get older, you realize this. For example, when there's a breakup in your relationship or an affair or something, you have very strong emotions. And again, you don't really access the levels of those emotions. You are confronted with this strong emotion of love or disgust or hate or something. But you have to go to a psychoanalyst or talk to your friends about it in order to access this, because once again, evolution has not given you access to those parts of the brain that generate those very strong emotions that profoundly shape your life. So thus, the adage of Western philosophy has always been know thyself. And we know it's a very difficult project. It's a project that will engage you your entire life. And it's a difficult one because evolutionary, we have these challenges that we are strangers to, much of our mind. And you really have to think hard about it. And why did you really say that, or why did you do that? What's really ulterior motive? It doesn't come natural to us. All right. So historically, what happened roughly 20 years ago, there was a series of articles. Francis Crick, this is the guy who discovered Crick and Watson, the DNA. I worked with him for 15 years. We published 20 papers, etc. So one of the key contributions that we made, we said, well, let's take it from psychology and philosophy to take it to neuroscience. And to look for something that's today called the NCC, the neuronal correlates of consciousness. So, there's some outside world, you have a guy with a German Shepherd, you perceive the German Shepherd, and there's something in your brain that's specifically responsible for the perception of the German Shepherd. That's called the neural correlate of consciousness, the minimal neuronal mechanisms that are jointly sufficient for that one conscious percept. And for every one conscious percept, when you smell, when you see your cat, there's one, and when you have the feeling that I will this action as a one, or feeling to be a great programmer, those are all conscious percepts. There will be some part of the brain involved. We can ask, is there something common? Do they all involve one particular part of the brain? Do they all involve a particular phenomena, like a standing wave of 40 hertz? Do they all involve a particular type of neuron or particular synapse? People have proposed all of those. And it's causal in the sense that if you induce the NCC, so if you from outside, like either invasive technology like Matrix, where you go inside the brain and you excite, you generate the same neural, the NCC artificially using electrode or some fancy, radiation technology, then you should have the percept. And conversely, when you inactivate, when you remove that or make that, you prevent the NCC from being activated, and there are lots of techniques, particularly in animals, we can do today to do that, then the conscious percept should be gone. So it's a causal relationship between the conscious percept in your head and some part of the brain that has to do something. And now you can ask, why do you have NCCs in the brain and not in the liver and not for the enteric nervous system, etc. Right? So here, for example, a very interesting case. So you may know, you've probably heard of the number now in our brain, well, in the brain of 4 aged Brazilian men, to be exact, the average number of neurons is 86 billion. So people count roughly, 100 billion, 10 to the 11 neurons in our head. Of those, more than 2 out of 3, probably closer to 80%, 69 billion are in a part of the brain called the cerebellum. Have you heard about that? Little brain here at the back. All right? So if you lose, well, here. So here we have a patient. She walked, a 24-year-old Chinese woman, married with a child, walks into a clinic because she has some high fever. And then they did a brain scan and they see this. There's a huge hole filled with cerebral spinal fluid. She never had a cerebellum. She is a very rare case of so-called agenesis of the cerebellum. She was born without a cerebellum. Right? So she only has on the order of 20 billion neurons. Now, it took her 7 years to learn to walk, in particular to speak. She speaks with an impediment, but she can speak and she can walk. But again, she has some sort of motor ataxia. And so we know from cases like that, if you, for example, now get a stroke or lose part of your cerebellum, you're going to walk like you're drunk, your speed will slurge, you're going to have difficulty doing things like this, or to rock climb, or to do ballet dancing, but nothing seems to be wrong with your consciousness. You can perfectly well describe everything you see or hear. So it tells us these neurons here, all 69 billion of them, they're beautiful, they're Purkinje cell, among the most beautiful neurons ever, don't seem to be involved in consciousness. And of course, it raises the question, why not? What's wrong with these neurons? Why aren't these neurons good enough to generate consciousness? And then people, so there's a lot of activity now in the neuroscience. We know it's associated with cortex proper. Cortex is a sheet. It's really a 2 plus epsilon dimensional computational technology. In us, it's a 14-inch pizza, 2 to 3 millimeter thick. You've got 2 of them for the left and the right brain. And this sheet expanded greatly throughout all it's a hallmark of mammals, neocortex. So mouse, it's this big. In us, it's like this. In a blue whale, it's like this. So we're not the animals with the biggest brain. It's blue whales and dolphins. And I won't go into this. There are lots and lots of experiments to show, imaging experiments as well as stimulation experiments. This is doing neurosurgery. We can stimulate. This is the underside of the brain, where you can stimulate. Lots of experiments using all sorts of different techniques to show essentially, to begin to discover where this neural correlate of consciousness is. So yes, it is associated with cortex. It's associated with particular parts in the back part of the cortex. And this is really interesting because we have 150 years of neurological patients that have various, interesting, bizarre, and strange deficits, and we can begin to explore that. And of course, this is a very crude level. You've got to remember that in a cubic millimeter of brain tissue, 1 by 1 by 1 millimeter, they're roughly on the order of 10 to the 5 cells. They're on the order of 10 to the 9 synapses. And those cells are not all alike. There are probably at least 100 different cell types in this volume. And we need to understand exactly which cell we're talking about and what are the wiring rules of this piece of tissue. Those are all things that we're doing over there. Because ultimately, we don't just want to say, well, we know whenever you're conscious, these parts of the brain here in the back have to be active. We want to know which specific neural mechanism is feedback. How essential is feedback? What about NMDA synapses? What about this circuit but not that circuit? Right? We really want to drill it down to the mechanistic detail to understand what gives rise to conscious sensation. So that's an ongoing project in the neurosciences. Now, assuming that's successful, and there's no reason why it shouldn't be. It's a standard scientific. It's complicated because the brain is, as I said, the most complicated system in the known universe. But it's a standard scientific question. But then it leaves us with a bunch of questions. So for example, I didn't talk about it. There's this part of the brain called the claustrum that we think is involved. The cerebellum we've seen experimentally isn't involved. Well, we want to understand why is this one critical and why is this one not critical? Why is not the so we know, for example, retina. If I just give rise to activity in the retina by stimulating, consciousness doesn't seem to arise in the retina. It's not a thing in the eye. It seems to be associated with cortex. Why is that? Your cortex, why do you not have conscious experience in your dreams, in your deep sleep, your non-REM sleep? Your neurons are active. It's not that your brain is turned off. Most in fact, your brain is not turned off. That's during coma. In sleep, it has different patterns. It has activity, it has waves, etc. But it's not really clear. It's not apparent at all why this brain, if I had this record from a single neuron, in fact, it's not easy to tell whether that single neuron is from a sleeping brain or from an awake brain. So it's not clear why the sleeping brain doesn't give rise to any conscious experience, the deep sleeping one. During seizures, your brain is hyperactive and it oscillates. And many of us believe that oscillation, particularly in this frequency range called gamma range, the 40 Hertz range, is critical to consciousness. While here, your entire brain is buzzing away. Why are you not conscious? Typically, when you have a grand mal seizure, you lose consciousness. Right? People have no memory of any event during the seizure, and they certainly don't act like they're conscious. Why is that? What about patients like this? So there are patients like this that may be 10 or 20 years on the ward where they have most of the activity of the brain is inactive, and then they have a few islands left. So these are patients. Intoxication, drug, alcohol, accidents, all sorts of different pathologies where you can't talk to the patient because the patient doesn't talk, doesn't respond, but you have this islands of activity. Well, is this patient conscious or not? Very difficult to tell. Then we have the question, what about a fetus? It's clearly alive. That's not the question, but does a fetus is conscious of anything? We don't know right now. What about a preterm? So this is a 20-year-old preterm. They can now, of course, survive due to technology, but again, it's not a question whether it's alive. The question is it conscious? Or a newborn infant. When is the infant first conscious? There's some evidence to suggest when you exit your birth canal, your mom, right? This is one of the biggest stressor in your life. In fact, there's more release of adrenaline during that event than any future event in your life. That may be, and then you cry, right? That's what the doctor always wants to hear. That may be the first time you're actually conscious of something. So it's interesting to understand what happens there. There's some type of anesthesia. Anesthesiologists, of course, they render you unconscious professionally, right? That's their job, to render you unconscious in a very controlled way. Again, it's not that the brain is shut off. In fact, in some type of anesthesia, like ketamine, is highly active, but you're not conscious. Why? We don't know. There are other strange states like sleepwalking. Some of you may have sleptwalk. In fact, typically in an audience this size, many of you sleepwalk. So, many often disappears around puberty, but in some it may go on your entire life. Sleepwalkers, they have open eyes. They can do complicated things like driving, like going to the bathroom, taking out things from the refrigerator, eating, etc. You don't seem to have, well, typically people don't have memories and they don't seem to be conscious, yet they're capable at least of relative routine things. Why is that? We don't know. Then there comes the question of animals that are very different from us. For example, that animals don't have a cortex, right? So if I look at a mouse or a monkey or a human or dog, it's very difficult. If I give you a little piece of dog or monkey, human brain, it's very difficult to say this is a dog brain, this is a monkey, and this is a human. It all looks the same. Scale is somewhat different. But then you have animals like this that are very complex. They can do imitation learning, a highly complicated creature, very different brain from us. Do they feel anything? Or are they just, are they just zombies? Are they just sort of a piece of matter, but it doesn't feel anything? And then, of course, lastly, now we come to these guys that raise a profound question. So if a patient could play Jeopardy as well as Watson can, if a patient can play chess as well as Deep Blue, if a patient can drive herself just like a Google or mobile car, if a patient can talk like Siri can, clearly everybody would say the patient is conscious. So on what basis, what objective basis do we have to say that Siri or anything else we're going to develop is or is not conscious? And of course we'll be confronted by this more and more over the, you guys are working on this, or with this question. And ultimately it's a question that transcends science, that impacts straight into the question of ethics and morality, because ultimately if you think about it, the reason we have, for example, laws, why is a puppy not just like a refrigerator? A refrigerator you can just dump on the, you just have to pay a fee and you can dump it. If you do that with a dog, you get sued, rightfully. But in the city, people will come after you. Why? Because we think ultimately it feels like something to be a dog. We don't feel we don't think it feels like anything to be a refrigerator. So this raises and so what I'm, in terms of ethics, ultimately we accord moral rights and ultimately also legal rights to anything that we feel has sensations, including people, including fetuses, including a person in coma, right? that person's still a legal person. We accord him or her certain rights. And so if it's true that computers can feel, I think it makes certainly all the difference from a moral and ethical point of view.
So presumably a sleepwalker has sensations.
A what?
A sleepwalker has sensations?
That's very difficult. So it's difficult to experiment with them because it's not easy to induce sleepwalking. And of course, once a person does walk, it's, so far at least, now with modern technology, you can do more experiments. Until recently, you couldn't equip a sleepwalker. No, it's
sensing votes and move around.
Well, if you mean by sensing, so clearly there's no, people have driven under sleepwalking. There's lots of evidence for that. So clearly, people are capable of some sophisticated level of visual motor behavior. There's no question about it. What is not known, certainly they don't recall anything. And they don't seem to be capable of any sort of particular, again, you can Google, there are lots of movies of, kids walking around sleepwalking, right? And they're sort of goofy, right? So many people think of them as sort of in a zombie state where they actually, because you don't sleepwalk, by the way, in REM. It's not true unless you have a REM disorder, which is very different. In sleepwalking, you're typically in deep sleep. You're not in REM sleep, so you're not acting out your dream. And there isn't much evidence that people are conscious in this state. But it's difficult to say. As I said, it's not easy to experiment with them. All right, so all the short and long of it, even if this project of studying the neural correlates of consciousness is a successful one, it still raises a number of questions. Again, they're not only scientific, but they're ethical questions, right? Because, it's a big deal. For instance, it's a question right now, do you need to anesthetize preterm infants if you need to do an operation on them? That's a big question because anesthetize is another stress. This already is a very fragile state to be preterm, right? Now, if you need to do an operation on the heart chamber, something, adding anesthesia into the mix, it's dangerous because it stresses, blood pressure goes down, etc. So there's a debate in the field. Until recently, these were not anesthetized because it was thought, well, they don't feel anything. Now there's a backlash. So again, all of these questions are not only scientific, they're also ethical and legal. And finally, they speak to who we are. Because once again, it's a Cartesian realization. The only way you know you're anything is because of your conscious feeling. If you would be a zombie, if you would have exactly the same behavior you have right now, if I couldn't tell from the outside, but inside it doesn't feel like anything, well, that's not life, right? Because there isn't anything there. If I say, oh, and I'm going to give you $1 billion, you can have $1 billion, but you will never feel anything anymore. Well, what sort of trade is that? I want to enjoy my life. I want to taste the wine. I want to enjoy travel, right? And if I don't have any of that, there is no point to life. Although my body still acts out everything, right? So it is absolutely central. And so finally, what we need is a theory of consciousness. We need a principle, a scientific, quantifiable, empirical, testable, clinical, meaningful account of how is it that, or what type of physical system can give rise to conscious experience, and ultimately what conscious experience is. So in the remaining 23 minutes, I will give this to you. All right? Okay, so this is really, this is the work of it. So it's by far the most promising theory that there is around of consciousness. I can just sketch it, of course, in this time in very high level. So the work of a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist, Giulio Tononi, who studies sleep and who studies consciousness. And this is his lab. And as a disclosure, I have published with him quite a bit. So ultimately, so it's an axiomatic theory. So I come from physics, so I really like theories that start with basics. And rather than saying, which is also known as a hard problem, taking a brain and trying to distill the brain and have consciousness emerge, this takes an opposite point of view. It starts, what are sort of the basic phenomenon that consciousness is? And then let's try to look at a mathematical calculus that can implement that, and then look at how that calculus translates to actually real mechanisms, like our brain, or like a brain in a dish, or like a computer, to understand what other system can have it. And it has rather surprising consequences for computers. So 8 says, there are 5 axioms. 8 says experience exists intrinsically. So this is nothing but the Cartesian cogito ergo sum. Totally independent of external observers. I know this is true because in the privacy of my head, tonight I'm going to dream, I'll wake up, everything else is dead, the rest of the world may as well not exist, but I have full conscious experience. Brain in the vat, same thing. Okay, B not only exists, it has parts. right? Even if I wake up in this in this hotel room where everything is dark, well, there's left and there's right and there's up and there's down. And of course, in a real scene, there's there's books and hands and objects and dogs and people and and smells, and so it's all these different. It's highly structured. It's different aspects. 3, it's incredibly rich. So each experience, whether it's the experience of a complete black hotel room, or the experience of the World Twin Towers, or this is a famous drawing, by the way, by Ernst Mach, the physicist, the Mach velocity is named after him, who first thought a lot about this. So every experience is one out of a trillion number of experiences. If you think about every movie you've ever seen, or every frame of every movie that's ever been made or will ever be made, contains one out of almost sheer uncountable number of different visual percepts, and then of course the olfactory percepts, and there are all sorts of body percepts, etc., etc. So it's very, very rich. Fourthly, it's much remarked upon by philosophers. It's integrated. It's unitary. It's only one. Whatever I see is a single percept. So right now, for example, I don't see a left half and a right half, and then I put them together. I experience a whole scene. I can, of course, do this and this, but that's different. Whatever I see as a whole. It's unitary, it's integrated, it's holistic. When you hear, so I'm going tomorrow on my honeymoon, 2 weeks to Machu Picchu. If I say honeymoon, you don't say, okay, that's funny, that's honey, the stuff the bee makes, and then there's this planetary object, and then you put it together. Right? No, honeymoon you perceive it as a whole, as it's a trip that people go after they're married, right? So it's unitary, it's holistic, and there's only one. So what I mean by that, your experience is one. There aren't this infinite variety of different experiences that are superimposed. So there isn't a Christoph that experiences things at a microsecond scale, and superimposed a Christoph that experiences things at an hour scale, and superimposed on Christoph on me that can experience blood pressure or anything else. There's only one experience. So it's unique. So now you think you translate those into a mathematical mechanism, because ultimately we want to be a scientist. We want to be concerned about mechanism, because we want to ask, what mechanism? Does my fridge have it? Does my dog have it? Does my baby have it? Does etc. So you think here. So we think in terms of simple neural networks here. So these are very simple neurons code. They can be in one of this, just for illustration, 1 and 2 states. It can be on or off. Sorry, off and on. And so here, these are just simple logical gate. They implement simple, a Boolean operation. But you can also do you can have neurons. The math gets a little bit more hairier, but in principle, so you have some mechanism. And you say, well, you have a mechanism in a state, and you have a certain TPM associated with it, right? A transition probability. So you pick a mechanism in the state. You pick your brain. Right now, my brain's experiencing something. So you look at the entirety of my brain, and you list all the neurons, if you think neurons are the relevant mechanisms. And then, it's in a particular state. And in a different state, my brain will experience something differently, whatever the content of my current experience is. So finally, you say, this is what exists. And by being in a particular state, it affects the future, and it affects the past, right? So you can ask, for example, what are the different states from which this current state derives? And then you ask, given this current state, what are the different and given the TPM and given the probabilities? So here it's all or none, but of course you could actually have finite probabilities there. What are the future states this mechanism could go into? And you say from an ontological principle, something exists in the measure that it makes a difference to itself. This is finally what consciousness is. It's a mechanism that makes a difference to itself. The more a difference it makes to itself, the more it exists. This goes back to a famous dialogue of Plato, where he has this Eleatic stranger appearing, and the Eleatic stranger suggests that existence really ties to how much of a difference do you make to the world. So in that sense, for example, President Obama, of course, who has vastly more causal power than any of us, right? He could start a nuclear war, in that sense has much more existence than a homeless here under the bridge who has almost, has very little power. It's an ontological principle. It's not a moral principle. And here it's being used sort of, consciousness exists to the measure that it makes a difference to itself, not to others. So that's if you're talking about interactions, like what difference can I make to others, but what's the difference my brain can make to itself? And the more difference it makes to itself, the more it's conscious. That's finally what the theory amounts to. So you say to exist, the system must have this cause-effect power. You can compute. This is sort of a little bit like the causality calculus of Pearl. Judah Pearl, you can write down, okay, you're in a current state. These are the past states you could have. These states could have given rise to this, and given you in this state, these states the network can give rise to, depending on the probabilities. So finally, you end up with five. You have your 5 axioms, and each one you translate into a calculus that applies to mechanisms. So first of all, you have a mechanism. You just postulate that the thing exists. It has composition. There are various sub-elements of it. So you can have. You can consider the entire network of 3 units, or you can consider only these 2 units, or only these 2, or only these 2 units. And each one you can ask what is cause and effect repertoire. You can compute the information held with in any particular state. So if you're just considering this, you can look at the causes, you can look at the effect, and you can compute how much information is transmitted between the current state and the past, and the current state and the future. You can ask how integrated it is. So the integration you ask, given that you look at all possible partitions of the system, of which of course there are many, Bell's number many in fact. If you look at all possible partitions, you see a system is integrated if you cut it, if this cut makes a difference. The more an integrated system is, the more a cut across some of its partition, the more difference will it make. So for instance, when I take a brain of a split brain patient, well, if I take the brain and I cut the brain in 2, and it makes no difference to the conscious experience, then the system doesn't exist at that state. But this is also where you can think about it independent of consciousness. What does it mean for a system to exist? Well, for a system to exist, think about it, the joint entropy has to be more than the sum of the individual entropy, because otherwise there are no interaction terms. So essentially this is what this says. And exclusion says, well, there's only one, you pick the maximum of this cause-effect power. So you can look at the system, you can look at all the various subsystems, you say, well, there's only one consciousness, is the one that has the maximum cause-effect power. All right, so now we can look at some of the consequences. I realize this is utterly inadequate, but you just have to bear with me. So the bottom line is that there's a well-defined calculus that given a mechanism, it could be transistors, it could be neurons, it could be some fancy other technology, that's you find this thing in a particular state, and you say, well, where did it, which state did it come from? Which state is it going to? You can compute something, it's called phi, it's a single number, it's a positive number that essentially tells you how integrated the system is. It's a positive number. The bigger the number, the more cause-effect power it has, the more it exists in this sense, the more it's conscious. And it also spans a space. So if you have a system like this that has 3 neurons, it can be on or off, so you get 8 potential states. So in principle, you can construct a state that has 2 to the 8 dimensions, 2 to the 3 dimension, 8 dimensions, and you can construct a high-order geometric concept. For each state of that network, you occupy a different point in this state. And finally, consciousness is this structure, this high-dimensional polytope in this incredible high-dimensional, for human brains, it's going to be trillions and trillions upon dimension. That finally says this is what consciousness is. Now, it has a number of really concrete. This all sounds very airy-fairy and crazy. But it has a number of very concrete outcomes. So in principle, it says you come upon this system, a brain, and it's in some state. And the theory, first of all, can in principle, not in practice, of course, it gets very hairy very quickly because of these of the combinatorial explosion. But you're looking at the state, and the system, if it has a number, if the integration is different from 0, it has some cause-effect power, it is conscious to some extent. Now we can ask, which systems have cause-effect power, which systems have integration, and you can describe, in principle, you can tell what the system is experienced in what the system is currently is it explains pain or pleasure without looking at the behavior. This theory doesn't say anything about the behavior. Essentially, it says consciousness has to do with the complexity of the system. So it's very different than thinking about Turing machine test. Because Turing machine test, of course, is all about the input-output behavior. This doesn't say anything about the input-output. It's just you have a network, you look at the TPN or you look at the circuitry, right? And based on the circuitry, you make a decision how integrated is it, how many different states can it have, etc. And then you ascribe consciousness to it or not, which is very different from a Turing test. All right, so for instance, you can have a system and it can have graded phi. So if you look at phi or phi max, you have a system like this that consists of 5 times 3 neurons, and they have a particular weight here. Then you can see, well, the phi of these little systems is small. And if you take the system as a whole, the phi is much bigger. And the theory says, well, you always pick the biggest. So here the entire system would be, this would be the neural correlate, if you want, of this system, and this is the total amount of consciousness. You now add noise to the system by perturbing these wires, and you look at the TPM again. Well, this hasn't changed because you're only adding wires in these intermodules, but the overall phi is smaller. So consciousness can wax and wane, of course, as it does in us, right? You know this over your day. When you're well rested, you wake up, or when you haven't slept in a day or two, or you're drunk, or you're on drugs or something, your consciousness can certainly wax and wane during the day, and of course it waxes and wanes across your lifetime. And here you have the paradoxical situation. If you add more and more noise to these wires, then suddenly you go to a sort of phase transition where the overall system, where the consciousness for the overall system collapses, because now the overall system, you've added so much noise, it's not really integrated anymore. It goes down to 0.03. And rather now you have 5 separate systems, each one of which is conscious. This makes, for instance, the following prediction, which soon can be tested. You probably all heard of split brain experiments, right? Well, so what happens if we now have a technology, and soon as we will have it for animals, so there are 200 million fibers in us that connect the left brain with the right brain. It's called the corpus callosum, that connect the two brains. Massive, 200 million fiber tract. What happens now if I progressively sort of reduce the bandwidth, if you want, of this fiber tract? Well, the theory says you look at the entire system, you compute the phi for it, and you can also compute it for the individual subsystem. So you can compute it for the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere and for the entire brain. Well, so the theory says, okay, as long as the brain has a bigger phi than the individual hemispheres, the brain will be conscious. That's you. At some point, when you add more and more noise, you restrict the bandwidth of the corpus callosum more and more. The phi of the individual left and right hemisphere will become larger than the whole phi. At that point, you will die. The consciousness associated with the whole will just abruptly disappear. Instead, 2 subconsciousnesses will disappear, the one for the left hemisphere and the one for the right hemisphere. And of course, this is exactly what happens during patient when the surgeon actually does the cutting. Of course, it's irreversible, and it's done during anesthesia. Now, with this technology, it also predicts as you then go up again, as you increase the bandwidth, then suddenly the 2 individual ones will disappear, and the whole will emerge. Same thing if I connect, for example, if I connect my brain to your brain. People have started to do this now. The theory says, well, as long as the bandwidth is relatively low, there's vastly more integration in my brain and in your brain than between us. So if I have a wire into Ernst's brain and here's a wire into my brain, I may be able to begin to access. So I know, for example, when you see something, or I begin to have access to your brain, but I'm still conscious Christoph, and you're still Oren. At some point, when the bandwidth is so high, then you and I will die, phenomenologically, and there will be this new thing, this amalgamation of Oren and Christoph. And again, you can reverse that. So it's a very interesting prediction. It will be proven at some point to be true or wrong.
Hopefully after your honeymoon.
Yes. There's a measuring device that this theory has given rise to. It's called ZipZap. So essentially what you do, there's a device called TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. So it's a figure 8 coil. You put it above your head. I've done it, and it sends magnetic pulses into your brain that give rise to Maxwell's laws, through currents, and will ultimately trigger some neurons. For example, if you do it above your left motor cortex, your right hand twitches. So what you do now, you take a person, you take an undergrad, you sleep deprive him for a day, because otherwise you wake up. And then, so now it's the second night and they're trying to sleep, and you zap their brain with this just subthreshold pulse. It's a little bit what you're doing essentially. Think about the Liberty Bell, right? And you're taking a hammer and you're knocking the Liberty Bell. And a good bell should have nice resonances. If you hit it, it should resonate for a long time. A bell like the Liberty Bell, which famously has, of course, as a crack, won't have these long reverberations. So that's essentially what you're testing here. How integrated is Cortex? Because that's what you're testing. That's what you're probing. And then you have EG. You have like 64, 128 EG electrodes. And folks, you can see if you do this during wakefulness, so here you measure the EG and then you do underlying current source modeling, and what you see, you stimulate here, then the impulse travels to the other part of the brain, then it ricochets over and goes here, then it goes around, so you get this electrical activity that goes around. So you're zapping the brain, and then you essentially, they want to get a simple measure of complexity, so they just sort of binarize it and do a Lempel-Ziff. So they finally get a number, it's called the Perturbation Complexity Index. It's just a number for how complex the awake brain is. Then you can do the same, for example, in a deep sleeping brain. There the response is actually bigger underneath directly the TMS probe, but overall it's much less it's much more stereotyped. And more importantly, you can do this in a, I'm almost done, you can do this in a whole bunch of patients. So here you have a bunch of anesthesiologists who volunteered for this experiment. So you plot this number, the perturbation complexity index. So it's just a mathematical procedure that allows you to quantify how complex is this resulting map of electrical activity. And it's a single number, positive, and essentially falls into two groups. And it's high when you're awake. And when you take people into deep sleep, it's low. When you anesthetize people, in this case anesthesiologist, 8 of them, anamidazodam, that's something like barbiturate, anazenon, that's a noble gas, or propofol, this always goes down. Same thing if you look at patients that are vegetative state, minimal conscious state, emergent conscious states, or locked-in syndrome, like in the movie Diving Bell and the Butterfly. These are, of course, fully conscious. They're just unable to move. Again, you can get at the level of individual subjects, you can distinguish whether they're conscious or not. So it seems to be, this has to be borne out by clinical studies, etc. But it's very promising as a potential first tool ever to tell sort of a consciousometer, right? To tell whether this patient in front of me who's not moving, is he or she actually conscious or not? That's from the theory. All right. There are lots of tests you can do, but let me, you can, for example, we've done this, you can do, you can evolve. Do you know what Breitenberg vehicles are? You have these simple animats that, very simple automata that have retinal sensors and some side sensors, and they have internal machinery. In this case, it's a Markov network, that a brain that describes their behavior, and that's all coded by genes. And now it's an artificial life environment where you mutate these organisms. You have mutation, and then you send these guys through a labyrinth, and you pick the top 10 performers, and you perturb their genes, and that changes the brains, and you iterate, etc., etc. And then you can show, for example, this is a nice lawful relationship between these numbers, how well adapted they are, and how this measure of consciousness, of integration. In other words, the more, it's almost by design. Integration means you can take advantage of all the information, rather than having separate encapsulated pathways, all the sensors are integrated, and you can make, it just makes for better behavior and for higher phi measures. Now, it makes a number of, the most interesting prediction it makes, particularly for computers, is that feed-forward system. So if you look at convolutional networks, like GoogleNet or all these other networks, that solve all the current the competition on ImageNet, they're all, of course, feed-forward, right? They're convolutional networks, and they're essentially all feed-forward networks in the various guises. Once they've been instantiated, once you computed all the gradients and learning is done. And the theory says, well, feed-forward networks are not, their phi measure is 0. Essentially, they don't make any difference to themselves. They don't have any cause-effect power on themselves because they affect the next stage, but they don't affect themselves. So the theory says that you can have arbitrary complex, the latest network I saw at Google has 22 stages now, and of course they are capable of identifying with some low probability 1,000 different categories. So again, they can do things that if a patient could do it, we would say the patient is conscious. But the theory says that it's not the behavior, it's the underlying circuitry. So finally, so it should here. So here you have two networks. You can unfold this heavy nonlinear network for finite number of time steps into a feedforward network. So in terms of I/O, they're exactly the same. They perform the same I/O function for a certain number of time steps. Yet the theory says, unlike a classical Turing test, this one has a measure of phi that's different from 0. This one has a phi that's 0. So it predicts that you cannot measure, in principle, whether or not a system is conscious by its behavior. You actually have to look at the brain. So in other words, who of you have seen Ex Machina? Right, so the theory would say, well, you can't judge by her. Essentially, the movie is about social engineering. The movie is fine, just like Blade Runner and Her. It's all about, can you get guys to believe that female software or female artifacts can fall in love with them and they fall in love with them. So it's more about social psychology than it's actually about whether or not Samantha in Her or Rachel in Blade Runner or Ava in Ex Machina actually is conscious or not. And the theory furthermore, so you cannot do that by testing. You actually have to do that by looking at the underlying circuitry, which in Ex Machina is some sort of unspecified neuromorpho. Remember when there's this brief glimpse at her brain. So the theory does not say you cannot build a machine that isn't conscious, but then you would have to build a machine that mimics the cause-effect power, for instance, of the human brain. So you'd actually have to build a neuromorphic machine, right, where the cause-effect power of the machine itself is not the cause-effect power of the underlying transistors, but it's actually the cause-effect power of the human brain. So in other words, you have to build neurons that have this vast parallel I/O, etc. So it's not that there's something magic about consciousness that only biological organism can have it. In principle, any mechanism can have it, but you have to build something that has that cause-effect power. And the analogy is a very profound one. It's with physics. So we know you can have a computer simulation that simulates the mass of a black hole, for example, the one that's at the center of our galaxy, which is roughly 10 to the 8 solar masses, right? And you can simulate that perfectly well on a normal digital machine. But space, the space around this computer simulation will not bend, right? Because why? Well, because this is the difference between the real and the simulated. You can simulate the effect of a black hole, but that's not the same as actually emulating a black hole, actually having a black hole inside your computer simulation. Same thing, the theory says you can simulate behavior. So in principle, for example, you may have heard about this human brain project of Henry Markram in Europe. Yes, in principle, in the fullness of time, if we simulate every single neuron in the human brain, you will be able also to simulate the behavior of a conscious being. But the computer simulation itself will never be actually conscious. All right, and so there, perfect. There, I leave it. Thank you very much for your attention.